I want you to think about words or action. What matters more? Going into this story here with Candace Owens. Now, Candace Owens and I don't agree on a lot politically. We do agree on Israel politically. And there is something that she said recently. There's a clip going viral on Twitter. I want to take you to the full part of that conversation, not just those 2 minutes on Twitter. What she said here to Piers Morgan about what Israel is doing, the vocabulary that she used is incredibly important when you are pressed with this statement. Well, how can it be a genocide? It's only 50,000 people. So one, I would argue and push back. The numbers are underreported purposefully. If you do the math, and Ralph Nader has done this, the math with the number of bombs that have been dropped and the density of Gaza, it's got to be at least about 200,000 people by now. So there's that. But when you say that, they're going to say, oh, well, you don't know that for sure. This is the number. This is the data. This is the number that's reported. So this is what we're going to go by. So the point that I'm making is that the pro-Israel side, and in this case, Piers Morgan, he is using that as a way to say it's not a genocide. But Candace said something that is incredibly important that I want all of us to start to echo. You ain't got to agree with Candace on everything, but she's right on this. First and foremost, she starts discussing, I don't know if you guys know this, but apparently she was awarded Anti-Semite of the Year. I mean, people come up with all kind of stuff, right? Anti-Semite of the Year, some award. But that isn't stopping her from talking about this issue. She's still talking about it. And a number of people probably would have backed away. So just keep that in mind. Listen to this.
I don't view Jewish people to be some exception where you're allowed to now call everybody anti-Semites because you can't actually debate what Bibi Netanyahu is doing and why so many people around the world are not comfortable with it. So yes, they can award that all they want. People are mocking it. It's now become like cartoonish. And they have, unfortunately or fortunately, completely removed the power from that term.
What is your view of Jewish people, of Judaism?
Yeah.
For the record, what's your view?
My view is that Judaism is a faith. Israel is a state, and it is not above critique. And that what Bibi Netanyahu has done to the Palestinians since October 7th is a Holocaust. It is a Holocaust that is being committed on Palestinian children and women. And I'm not going to quiet my perspective on that, to kowtow to whatever the prevailing narrative is at the New York Post.
So notice how she said she's not going to, and this is another thing about her not being attached to the Daily Wire anymore, which I think is better for her. It's because now she doesn't have to worry about, well, do I have to still walk this line because of Ben and all the rest of them at the Daily Wire who were critical of her criticism of Israel. She doesn't have to worry about that anymore. And don't get me wrong, people are still going to criticize her, but she's not working with the people directly who are criticizing her. But even though she got that Anti-Semite of the Year, the award, whatever, like I said, it's just weird the stuff people come up with now. Even though she got that award, that was done in an attempt to silence her, but she's not being silent. Right after she got that award, she went on to do this interview and she goes pretty in depth about what is happening and what Israel is doing. So you guys got to understand, sometimes these tactics that are used, it's in an effort to silence you. When you see a lot of these smear campaigns against people, sometimes there may be some truth to it, but from what I've seen, particularly in the space, a lot of times it's bullshit. The smear tactics that are done towards like the gray zone, the smear tactics that have happened towards like even those of us that are saying, leave the Democratic Party, they'll smear us as right wing or whatever, because they have nothing else, right? So these things are done to discredit that person and to stop them from spreading the message that they're spreading. And I don't agree with every message that Candace Owens has decided to spread. I mean, she said so herself later on Twitter that not only was it, acceptable when she was at the Daily Wire, but it was encouraged for her to go after the Black community. So just keep that in mind. So I don't agree with every message that she tried to spread, but this one in particular, I do appreciate the fact that she is still continuing to discuss it and not back down, even though she received that award, because that was a tactic. When they banned her from Australia, that was a tactic, another one to try to silence you. These are things that will happen, right? Listen to what else she says here.
I had Dan Bilzerian on Uncensored recently. I got to say, it took a pretty shocking turn, the interview. I hadn't fully factored in just how, in my opinion, after talking to him, brazenly anti-Semitic he is. And this included this clip here. Do you not understand why Jewish people might feel a sense of victimhood, given that 6 million of them were killed in World War II by a genocidal monster in the Holocaust? Do you not understand why that might make Jewish people feel that, yes, they have indeed been victims?
Yeah, I mean, that figure's been revised. They said that it was 4 million that died in Auschwitz, and then they said it was down to 1 million. So they've revised the figure.
Well, how many people? How many people do you think were killed in the Holocaust?
271,000 that died in Auschwitz.
How many do you think were killed in the Holocaust?
I don't know, but I would bet my entire net worth that it was under 6 million. The evidence all says that it was less than 6 million. I mean, just the mathematics don't work. Like, you can't cremate that many bodies.
I'm sorry, but I just find that unbelievably offensive, and I'm not even Jewish. You see, this is where I'm like you. I think there's been a weaponization of all these things. Whether you're transphobic, you're racist, you're sexist, you're anti-Semitic, whatever it may be, you're Islamophobic. I mean, people just spray this stuff around all the time to the extent where it does become meaningless. And actually, people who genuinely are those things, they get caught up in the wash and almost protected by the kind of wash of stuff. But when you hear someone like Dan Bilzerian, what do you feel about someone like him?
Just so I actually didn't watch that interview, so I haven't seen it in its full context, and I try never to weigh in on clips because there'll be something I'm missing,
sure.
and then everybody screams at me. But what I will say is this. The larger discussion that's happening right now is whether or not having survived a Holocaust gives you the permission to commit a Holocaust. And for whatever reason, people have been, what I would say, milking the Holocaust narrative in the same way that Black Americans were milking the slavery narrative, and essentially saying, like, we lived through this and we survived this, and so now nobody can say that anything we do is wrong. And that's the big issue today, is that we have so many people that will not recognize that it is totally feasible that a Jewish person, and I'm speaking here about Bibi Netanyahu, could do something as horrific as what was done to the Jews throughout World War II or throughout history.
Pause here for a second. I just want to echo, say something here. I actually have never heard Black people say that you can't criticize us because of slavery. I've never heard that. So I don't know where Candace heard that from, but I've never heard that.
An accurate comparison. I'll tell you why I say that. As we know, I mean, whatever Dan Bilzerian wants people to believe, 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. Another 6 million people were murdered by Hitler and the Nazis. The numbers of people being killed in Gaza are, in my view, have gone way beyond what is acceptable as a response to October the 7th. However, you're still talking about, at the moment, a death toll of under 50,000. There's no comparison in the amount of dead people compared to the Holocaust. So do you understand why?
But it is a Holocaust.
Pause. Does everybody see what Pierce is doing? This is why I'm telling you they keep holding on to the number that has been reported. Because as long as they can say, well, it's only been 50,000 people, they can follow that with, well, it's not actually a genocide based on the numbers. This is why they keep holding on to that number. And I think we've talked about this before on the show where, you know, the Palestinian, like the Ministry of Health, that they underreport on purpose because they don't want to overreport and then find out, oh, it's not da-da-da. So they actually underreport. But if you do the math, like Ralph Nader apparently did, with the number of bombs that have been dropped, the density of the area, and the starvation, don't forget, the starvation is still happening. The numbers are more than 50,000. There's no way. It's basic math when you do it, right? So he's holding on to that number. Listen to this.
What's happening?
Well, is it though?
Yes. Well, the
Because
burning
I think
bodies,
language is really important.
I think
in
language
these
is really
things.
important as well, and that's
People
why
say Holocaust, genocide,
I
and so
think
on.
what's
I think
happening is a Holocaust. The burning bodies of the children that I'm seeing every day, and we spoke about this a little bit on my show, but I have recognized that the ability to see this stuff every day has transformed my opinion. Maybe the numbers wouldn't have gotten so high if people had spoken up when it was happening at the very beginning during World War II. And so I want to use my platform to say that I believe that they are intentionally executing a Holocaust. I think Bibi Netanyahu, there's tons of evidence, and obviously the Western media is not reporting on this, but the corruption trials that are going on with Bibi Netanyahu pertaining to October 7th and him editing the transcripts and the prior knowledge that he knew is now becoming extremely pertinent. It is a question as to whether or not he allowed the attacks to take place, essentially to then be able to go in and to commit this Holocaust against the Palestinians. Now, based on everything that I've looked into and stuff that I had not seen before, because the Western media doesn't cover it, Bibi Netanyahu caught off camera speaking about how he had no intention of following the Abraham Accords and how he was going to get around it. He has, I believe, genocidal ambitions, and that's enough. We don't need to dispute, go backward or forward. Do I think Bibi Netanyahu has genocidal ambitions against the Palestinians? The answer is yes.
Yes.
Do you think he's a war criminal?
Yes. I believe he's a war criminal. And I think that the issue is how much power he has, particularly in America. And I want to make sure that I'm just crossing or I guess making that clear to people across the pond. You know, in America, we have lobbying. You guys don't have lobbying here. And so this is why it might seem...
We do, but not to the same degree.
Yes, like AIPAC spent $100 million in our elections. And what that means is that they're able to write fellowships, they're able to pay journalists, they're able to pay people to attack and take down people who speak against their initiatives. And they are, AIPAC, I would say, is very much pro-Likud party, pro-Bibi Netanyahu. And this is why you have seen people like me being attacked in the way that they have been attacked for what I believe is just a human stance on what's happening to the Palestinians. I don't care if you had flipped it, if it had not been Israelis, if it had been, you know, if it had been Christians doing this to Muslims, I would say the exact same thing based on the images that I've seen. But there is a ton of evidence that Bibi Netanyahu allowed October 7th to take place, including the things that we found out, because I now read Haaretz daily to
You don't
read.
actually think he knew it was going to happen?
Well, let's just talk about the facts. We don't have to speculate on that.
Pause. Let's not forget the article that the New York Times published, which stated that the IDF knew a year and a half before October 7th that it was a possibility because they received access to the plans that Hamas had for October 7th. That article went on to say that they did not consider it to be reality. They didn't think that it was serious. There's been plenty of times where Israel didn't really think something was seriously a threat, but they acted like they were preactive so that it would not even become the possibility of a so-called threat towards them. So think about that for just a second. Why would you not act unless you wanted it to happen? Some people don't like it when I say that, but if you just follow the timeline, it does not add up. You're supposed to believe that the state of Israel that has all of this intelligence, and Gaza does not, by the way, have this intelligence. They have all this intelligence. They also have an Iron Dome. They have intelligence in Israel where they can look through spyware and they could probably pick up the crumb off of your shoe. They have enormous amount of intelligence. And they received this information and they chose not to try to prevent it. Does this make sense to anyone? Because it doesn't make sense to me. Think about that.
What we do know is that they did intercept the hostage plan before it took place, right? The 250 hostages that came out in Haaretz media. We also know that Egypt gave them a warning that the attacks were going to take place. Egypt said that they were being ignored. That was a fact. I've been to Israel. Have you been to Israel? We know it's the size of New Jersey. We know that it takes 15 minutes to get from one end to the other. And we know that every 5 feet, there's a person in your face holding a gun. That attack went on for 2 hours without interruption. I find that hard to believe. And this gets to the, I guess you could say, the nucleus of the corruption trial against him, when now he's even arguing with the IDF minister who he fired, Yoav Gallant, am I saying his last name correctly? Where they're saying that some funny stuff happened on October 7th, and they are explicitly accusing him of feeding lies to the Western media. This is crucial. You know, and this could be the undoing of everything. If we find out that he had prior knowledge And we do know for a fact that he said that he intentionally wanted to take over Palestinian territory. You should find that clip and play it on the show, because it's very significant when he asked the reporter to turn off the camera and then he starts speaking about his plans for the Palestinians. This was years ago. I think Bibi Netanyahu is a monster. And I think the people that are still standing by him and supporting him, you know, I wouldn't want to have that on my conscience.
Notice what she said there, intentionally. That word is key. Intent. Hold on to the word intent.
Let's turn to the Palestinians, who I think have been appallingly oppressed for many decades. I've made no secret of that. But what Hamas did on behalf of the Palestinian people,
Horrific.
October the 7th, was an utterly heinous terrorist attack.
Absolutely. No question about it.
So my question would be, let's go back to October the 8th. What should have been Israel's response to that, given the scale of it?
Well, first and foremost, there had to be a response. And we know that the IDF is very capable of a surgical tactical response, because they've done it over the years plenty of times, in which they're able to take out terrorists. We just watched them execute a beeper attack and hit out Hamas terrorists. So this
Which I think is a very relevant point, because if they could do that to 3,000 Hezbollah terrorists, why couldn't they be as precise with Hamas?
Because they don't.
Well, they could, Pierce. That's the thing. There is no, they couldn't have, they could have. That was not the goal. The goal was to take over the land. I think I have a fuzzy camera. My camera just went fuzzy for some reason. There we go. The goal was to take over the land. So it's not about, and we have to change the vocabulary. We can't just continue to say, why couldn't they? Let's change the way that we speak about things. Can we do that, guys? Talking to the audience. So we have to stop saying, and this goes with politicians too, we have to stop saying, why couldn't they do this? Why couldn't they do that? There is no why couldn't they. They could. They chose not to, because the intent was never to try to prevent. The intent is to respond. The intent is to react. I want us to get in the habit of stop saying, why couldn't you? Why couldn't they? Right? So Pierce is saying that. And if I was having that conversation with Pierce, I would tell him, stop saying why they couldn't. You just said they had enormous intelligence. They could. That was not the goal. Go back a little bit so you can hear what she says right here. Okay.
That the IDF is very capable of a surgical tactical response, because they've done it over the years plenty of times, in which they're able to take out terrorists. We just watched them execute a beeper attack and hit out Hamas terrorists. So this
I think it's a very relevant point, because if they could do that to 3,000 Hezbollah terrorists, why couldn't they be as precise with Hamas?
Because they don't want to be. They want to level it, because they want to take it over. And I believe, and you can see this, by the way, in the videos of the settlers dancing. I mean, why do they have settlers already ready? That does not seem strange that this quickly you already have settlers that are going in and taking over the territory, and you're hanging, children's toys.
Well, what should Israel have done, though? What would have been?
They should have just taken out the Hamas terrorists.
How do you do that when they're embedded amongst civilians?
Listen, I'm not an IDF minister, but what I can say is, going back to that beeper attack, it seems pretty precise. And there have been many examples of them doing that in the past. So I just don't buy the BS of we actually just have to take down entire towers and buildings. It doesn't even make sense. I mean, I'm not an engineering major, but if you're telling me that there's a tunnel under everywhere, you only have to hit a tunnel at a couple of points to render it completely useless.
Exactly. And isn't this the same thing that the U.S. government did with bin Laden? They found him in a tunnel, right? They went right into the tunnel. So Israel gives away their own game, because when they tell you that they know that they're hiding in tunnels, but they're not going into the tunnels, you already know what the game is. Anybody else still defending what Israel is doing at this point is either naive, foolish, or they're in on it. They support what Israel is doing. And the US government does support that. Now, they're not going to come out and tell you that. Biden's not going to come out and tell you that. Hell, Kamala's not going to tell you that. None of them are going to tell you that, because that would make them look pretty bad, right? No, they're not going to say that, but they do. If they didn't support what Israel was doing, they would stop giving them weapons just like that. They could also stop giving them weapons, because they're starving people in Gaza still. They're still starving them. You can watch videos, you can Google and see videos from nurses and doctors that are in Gaza that are repeatedly doing these interviews on corporate media telling people they're not allowing the food and the supplies to get in. That's not coming from Palestinians. That's coming from American doctors who are over there. So this is the thing. Their goal was not to take out Hamas. I said this over and over again. They were never really trying to find Hamas. They were trying to level Gaza all together. And the sooner people understand that, the sooner they can stop asking this question about why is it that we haven't had a ceasefire yet? We haven't had a ceasefire because the U.S. government doesn't really want them to have a ceasefire. The only reason they even started saying ceasefire is because of all the pressure from the protesters. They didn't expect that to happen. That's the only reason. That was just to calm us down. So just keep that in mind.
So the idea that they had to level the entire place plus go out into refugee camps doesn't make any sense. Like I said, I think their goal, and as they do, they have all these policies mowing the lawn, where they kill a certain amount of Palestinians every year. This is genocidal. The aims here are genocidal.
Your father-in-law, very highly well-regarded man in this country, Lord Michael Farmy, said the Israeli Defense Forces were acting in a highly accountable way in an extremely complex and difficult environment. We cannot forget that they have been forced to prosecute this war. Obviously, a different interpretation of events there. Have you discussed this with him?
Yeah, I mean, I try to separate my politics from his politics because I think it's unfair in any family to say, well, what does your mom think? What does your cousin think? What does my sister think? My sister's a Democrat, What I can say is I deeply respect him. He's done a tremendous amount of work. And I want to say this. I was on the Zionist side. Let's not forget this. For years, I worked for Prager University. I worked for Daily Wire. And so I was much more sympathetic to, I would say, the Zionist cause throughout my entire career. But the difference is, and I think we spoke about this on my podcast, generationally, with the access of social media, being able to see these things every day versus the person who, as you described it, as you are still, because you're kind of a combo, who hears the thud of the newspaper and reads the newspaper and believes that, or, this kind of becomes or colors their worldview, is very different. Social media completely transformed my perspective on what's happening in Israel and Palestine. And I'm disgusted with myself for not being more awake.
Okay, but that's
to
interesting because...
Pause that for a second. Something I want to add here as well. Many of us that grew up in the church, we were taught these things too. And if you're watching and you're like me, and people are like, oh, not in the black church. No, we were taught that in the black church too. If you're like me and you grew up in the church, you were taught this too. That not that they were supposed to go and kill all these Palestinian people, but you were taught that Israel was the Holy Land and that was supposed to be for the Jewish people. And then you learn about, in Revelations and all that stuff. Like it's really having flashbacks here. We were taught that. We were taught that was supposed to be their sacred place. Now, I was really young back then. The last time I remember asking questions about something that was interpreted by our pastor at that time from the Bible, I got some really strange looks. And I was just a teenager and I had a question. And I learned very quickly there were just certain questions, like you weren't supposed to question it. You weren't supposed to question not just the biblical text, but you damn sure as hell weren't supposed to question the preacher who was interpreting the biblical text, not keeping in mind that different people have different interpretations of the Bible. There's also different versions of the Bible as well. Some people follow the Old Testament. Some people follow the New Testament. Some people kind of look at both. I mean, there's so many different. And so you were taught pretty early on that this is how it was supposed to be. So when people ask the questions, well, why do Christians support what's happening? Because that's what we were taught in the church. Right? I had to do my own research, guys. I didn't know when I was growing up in the church, I didn't know these things were happening to the Palestinian people. I didn't know anything about this stuff. I learned more as I got older. And a journalist named Abby Martin made one hell of a documentary. And that really opened my eyes. And I started to pay more attention, and I started to read more and more about it. So if people don't educate you about the issue, you can go your whole life believing this is right. It's just something to think about.
Can social media also, can it wrongly skew a narrative? In other words, can it reinforce one view, which is very quickly established? I mean, I was astonished how quickly the narrative after October the 7th became anti-Israel and very pro-Palestinians stroke Hamas in many cases. I found that quite terrifying that that was the case, notwithstanding my own view about how Palestinians have been treated before that. But could it be, I mean, you're a very smart person, but you say that you were affected by social media. Social media was incredibly partisan behind the Palestinians almost immediately, to the extent where I would argue, looking back at the whole time, that I've argued persistently, well, what would be proportionate? I can't think of anything Israel could have done, given that Hamas were embedding themselves amongst civilians. I don't know how they could have attacked Hamas without being criticized, whatever they did.
They would have been criticized, but not to this degree. Everyone was expecting a response, and myself included. We're, like you said, and we agree on this, we're way past that. So that's not even a question anymore. There had to have been a response, and you are correct that no matter what, the response would have been criticized. But now there are questions about whether or not, like I said, they allowed this attack to happen, and I think this corruption trial will tell us much more. My instincts are telling me yes, but to go back to your question about whether or not social media can color you the wrong way, for the first time ever, we were just able to see what was happening in Palestine. Before, we just had to rely on legacy media who has told us.
Did you believe all you were seeing?
Unless you saw the documentaries, like I told you guys, Abby Martin's documentary, Max Blumenthal and Dan Cohen had a documentary. Unless you saw those things, unless you were reading books by Norm Finkelstein, and reading a book is one thing, but seeing the images just says a lot more. Right. So a lot of people come after Ta-Nehisi Coates right now because he also has video footage of him over there. He just wrote a book called The Message about what he experienced while he was over there. And he's getting attacked from a lot of people because he's telling people the truth. And the reality is a lot of people really did not know. You know how many people I've spoken to that said they had no idea what was happening to the Palestinian people pre-October 7th, before October 7th happened. It wasn't until October 7th that a lot of people were like, whoa, what is happening here? I didn't know about this. I didn't know about occupation. A lot of people didn't know. You guys saw it yourself. I showed it on the show where Marianne Williamson had an interview with one of the girls from, I think the name of that singing group is called Three Harmony or something like that. Anyway, she had an interview with Lauren from that girl pop group, and Lauren had to correct Marianne and tell her that Gaza is under occupation. Remember, Marianne had to issue a statement on Twitter telling people that she didn't know that Gaza was occupied. So that's what I'm saying. A lot of people just weren't aware.
When I first saw it, I kind of wanted to wait. You know, I was trying to just sort through everything.
Because I'm still not sure all the stuff I see is right.
Well,
it's very
some
hard
of it,
to...
well, but I'm now getting my information because I ended up signing up for Haaretz in Israeli newspapers because they're protesting it. They're calling this an ethnic cleansing.
I read that stuff all the time, yeah.
If Israeli newspapers are calling this an ethnic cleansing, why do we not have people in the Western media that have the courage to call it the same? It's clearly not anti-Semitism. Why on earth would Haaretz media or a Haaretz Israeli newspaper be anti-Semitic and want to see the undoing of Jews? Again, this goes back to AIPAC and back to lobbying. But to answer your question, that piqued my curiosity, and I couldn't believe that essentially everything that I had these presets to believe about Jews, everything was existential. Again, that sort of Holocaust upbringing in my mind culturally, seeing so many Holocaust movies, I kind of had these factory settings where I instantly always wanted to see Jewish people as the victim. And it was very hard for me to kind of shed that and to...
But a lot of Jewish people were victims here too.
Correct. But what I'm saying is my factory...
So it's not wrong for them to play the victim if they're genuinely being victims.
If they're genuinely being victims, correct. But when I say my factory settings, what I mean is that the second a Jewish person got hysterical about anything, I just assumed they were telling the truth and were the victims. I'm just kind of going back and assessing my own character flaws. I got this wrong in my political career. What you should do is not have these factory settings and actually examine the facts, right? And so when I started to do that, what I started noticing was I wasn't even allowed to ask a question. So I'd see something and then I'd say, well, what is this? And then suddenly it was anti-Semitism. And that right there to me signals you're not telling me the truth because you shouldn't have to do that, right?
That's right. So that part right there, again, at least she's willing to admit that she didn't have it right before, but she was willing to learn. A lot of people aren't willing to do that. A lot of people are really doubling down here to try to support and defend Israel. And again, I think it has to do with the way a lot of us that grew up in the church were raised. And I don't know, I'm curious, you know, I haven't been to church in a while, but I'm curious, what are churches teaching right now about this particular conflict? I'm really curious. And I say that because especially a lot of younger people are very much aware of the true story of the creation of Israel at this point in time. So I wonder, what are the churches talking about now? How are they addressing this issue? We'll go on a little bit more here, and then I want to show you something else.
Nobody is going
But I
to
think that
side.
works. I think that works in almost every single debate in the world right now. I see it the other way around, where you get being accused of being an Islamophobe if you dare to criticize anything on the Palestinian side, even if a lot of the stuff that's been going on is worthy of criticism.
I haven't seen that, and I say this as someone who was deeply critical of people that were Islamic throughout my entire career, because again, I jumped into politics, and there's a certain perspective that you're supposed to have in America about Zionism, and you're supposed to kind of marry yourself to it. And despite all of the things that I now kind of blush when I look back on, that I sort of had those factory settings, they never kind of just like routinely dismissed me. They just kind of were like, well, she's bought and paid for, never called me an Islamophobe, whatever it is. I just want to be fair. And I want to be fair. If something happened tomorrow and in an elite place in America and a bunch of Jews were killed and targeted, I want to stand on my platform and say what is happening to Jewish people is wrong. I'm not married to hating Jews, because I think what Bibi Netanyahu is doing is wrong. It has nothing to do with the Jewish people at large. This is a foreign state. Yep. He's allowed to be criticized in the same way that I criticize Biden, in the same way that you can criticize Trump. I'm criticizing Bibi Netanyahu, and I think the ICC got it correct in pursuing an arrest against him.
And she's right. And so I want to go ahead and stop that right there. And I want to show you why it was really important that she mentioned the word intent. What are his intentions? I think that's something that we need to hold on to, that word right there. And I want to show you why. Because people keep going back to the number, and they're not looking at what the UN defines as a genocide. The United Nations defines genocide. And I want you to see the definition of the word genocide. This is the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Article 2. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part of national, ethical, racial, or religious group. Let's just stop right there for a second and look at what it says. This is the word, ladies and gentlemen. It's that word intent. When Piers Morgan says, how can it be a genocide if there's only been like 50,000 people that have been killed? And I told you, I don't believe that number. I think it's more people. There's more bodies that are buried under the rubble, and it's probably closer to like 200,000 people at this point in time. But I digress. The number at this point isn't as relevant as Piers Morgan thinks it is. And a lot of people who are supporting Israel are holding on to that number. But the reality is, if you look at the UN definition of genocide, it involves the word with the intent. So the point that Candace was trying to make is that Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud party have been very vocal about their intention to flatten Gaza, to take the land, to get rid of the Palestinian people. This is not a secret. It's not like it's hush hush behind some closed door. These are statements they have made publicly. They called them all Amalek. Don't forget about that. They've been very vocal about taking the Gaza beachfront property and building it up as some type of resort area. Leave Gaza aside for a second. Go to the West Bank. Removing the Palestinian people from their homes, taking their homes. So it's not secret. So the next time that someone comes to you and they say, well, it's not a genocide because the numbers are blah, 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 instead of pushing back and saying, well, actually, if you do the math, the real numbers are blah, 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 because they're just going to come back to you with another, well, you don't know that because that's not what the data says. Show them the definition on the UN's website. Show them what it says. It is that key word, intent. Killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in parts. Notice it says, or in parts. So a genocide doesn't mean all the people. It can even be just in parts. Imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So the first two right here, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. They even include mental. Deliberately inflicting on the group's conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole and part. The first three all apply. Just the first three alone. Starvation, destruction. I mean, come on. And the intent. And that's what you need to remember. We can put the link to this in the chat for people, so you have that as a reference to go back to. Because when it comes to Israel, when we talk about words or actions, for Israel, it's both. Because their actions show you that they're trying to kill all the Palestinian people and they want the land. But they also have the words to back it up, because their words show their intentions. Something to think about. Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.